Hosted by, I can't say that word. It's just so hard for me to say. I don't know why.
That's great. We all have one of those.
Hosted by Bruesehoff. We all know her from 2 years ago, actually, with the Growth Talk. So, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Well, thanks for having me. How many of you, and this is not like a test, but how many of you were all here for my talk 2 years ago? Raise your hands. If you weren't, it's totally okay. You're not in trouble, I promise. Okay. Just helps me give an understanding. I just promise you're really not in trouble. Fabulous. Well, then it just gives me an idea. I'm going to bring my little stool over here. They won't bite. You can come sit if you want. This is my... We're just gonna party. I know, and it's kind of funny. I've got a microphone, but it's always easier for hearing anyway. There we go. It's a party. Absolutely. Fabulous. So I'll give you a little bit of background of who I am and how I come to this work. And then my thoughts are, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world today and why this conversation is important. And then what does this mean for us as people of faith? What does it mean for you? I think everyone here is related to the congregation in some way, right? Okay, because that wasn't true last time. So that's kind of awesome, actually, because we get to be really specific about what this means to us as Lutherans of faith. And if that changes as people trickle in, that's okay, too. So my name's Jamie. I use pronouns like she, her, and they, them. That just means you can use either, and that's fine with me. I am the parent of 3 lovely, for the most part, children. Always lovely? I don't know. So I am married to a Lutheran pastor. We live outside of Philadelphia, New Jersey, and our oldest child, our daughter, is transgender. And so she transitioned when she was 8 years old, socially transitioned to live as herself in the world. And in the course of that, we did a lot of learning about what that meant, and then a lot of teaching to not only kind of circles that just kept expanding with our family, our extended family, grandparents. We've got 3 of their grandparents here today, which is kind of fun. And then like those further family members, and then like our community and our church. At the time, my spouse was a pastor in a small congregation in Sussex County, New Jersey, so way up north, the other side of the state. And so our community, our congregation, her schools, and so on, and those circles of advocacy and education just got wider and wider until this became what I do for a living, which was never the plan. And so now I get the joy of getting to work all over the country with congregations and businesses and schools and healthcare providers and policymakers to say, what does it look like to create a space and a world where LGBTQ plus people of all ages, but especially transgender and non-binary young people, can thrive. And the intersection of faith and LGBTQ plus or LGBTQIA plus identity is a unique one. I will say my daughter often, so she's now 19 years old. She is thriving by every definition of the word. She keeps us on our toes for sure. She's a freshman at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire studying government. But she will often say that people, when we went into LGBTQ plus spaces, people were shocked to hear that her dad was a pastor and that we came from a family of faith. And when we went into faith spaces, people were shocked to hear that she was transgender and then that was part of her identity. And so she always talks about how these 2 identities are not mutually exclusive, even though the world often treats them as such. And so that's how I came to write the book I did, because as we were navigating this with our young child, there were lots of resources, well, not lots, this was 11 years ago, so not nearly as many as there are now, but we could find resources for supporting young transgender people, and we could find heady theological takes. Both my spouse and I have a seminary degree. Mine's in theology for outdoor ministry. Summer camp is my jam. And so we both had this advanced theological training, and we could read the really heady text, but there was nothing accessible to the average person that says, you don't have to choose between your child and your faith. You might have to choose between your child and your church, but that's a different thing altogether. And so I wanted that resource to exist, because here's the thing, people of faith, specifically Christians, have done and continue to do the most significant harm to the LGBTQ plus community personally and politically. And that continues to be true. And so that's not something, I think, sometimes we hear that and we can feel defensive, like, well, that's not me, I didn't do anything wrong. And I'm sure you didn't. You are a wonderful human being, I can tell by knowing all of you and being with you here today. But it is our responsibility as people of faith who are called to do justice and carry out God's work in the world to be as vocal, boldly, loudly, and joyfully celebrating LGBTQ plus people as called and claimed children of God, and to be just as loud as those saying otherwise, because otherwise we're not living out our call. And so silence is complicity, and I think that's the really hard thing, because a lot of us, it's overwhelming. Everything going on in the world is very overwhelming, and to feel like, well, that's, I just want to be a good person, come to church on Sundays, care about the people around me, and that's enough. But that's not actually what the gospel calls us to do. The gospel calls us to do a lot more than that. Like, it starts there. It starts in caring for the people around us. But it's about lifting up the most marginalized and the vulnerable, and figuring out what that means and how we disrupt systems of power that oppress all of us in some way, shape, or form. So that's a little bit about how we got to where we are today. So my daughter's been Rebecca for 11 years now. We just celebrated Rebecca Day. Actually, yesterday was the 11th anniversary of her going out into the world as herself. We sent her some cream puffs. She was very happy. And so, I mean, those 11 years have covered a lot. Like, they've included heart-exploding joy and devastating grief. We've navigated really, really hard stuff, whether that's navigating the challenges and shifts in policy and what's going on in the broader world, advocating for her to access the health care that her doctors suggest and say is appropriate for her, dealing with the hate that's out there. Because our family has been really, really public advocates, we get a lot of hate. And the worst hate we get is in the name of Jesus. The only death threats we've ever gotten have been in the name of Jesus. And that's something to just, we have to know that, and it makes me uncomfortable to say it out loud. I hope it makes you uncomfortable. We kind of have to sit in that and know that that's what's going on. And so there's been really, really hard stuff, and then there's been the most extraordinary joys. On the second anniversary of her transition and the 10th anniversary of her baptism, we remembered her baptism and celebrated her forever name and did a name blessing, which her grandfather who had baptized her was able to preside over. And so just really beautiful moments of saying, this is what it looks like to love the human being in front of you. And we've gotten to walk with people who are not the people out there waving pride flags in the marches or those kinds of things, but that are good human beings who care about people and whose hearts have been shifted to understand what that requires of us. This story I always tell when I think of our congregation that we were in when she first transitioned, is of the guy who I really thought was going to be the most vocal problem, like he was going to have the most concerns, because he had an opinion about everything, and those opinions didn't really align with my opinions on lots of things. He was a beloved child of God, but we disagreed a lot. And I thought that he might be an issue. And after the first Sunday that Rebecca showed up at church as herself, he came up to my spouse and said, listen, I don't understand this whole transgender thing, but she used to hide behind you and refuse to say hi to me on a Sunday morning. And today, she ran up to me, twirled in her dress, and gave me a high five. What more is there to know? And the truth is, there is a lot more to know. I mean, that's why we have conversations like that, but that's where we start. We start with taking these things that we see as issues in the world to human beings and being able to see the human being in front of us. And so when I think about the moment we're in, and when we talk about the LGBTQ plus community, I was here talking with you all 2 years ago. And so when I looked up when that was, and I was like, wow, 2 years. A lot has happened in 2 years. Let me be perfectly clear. This is not about political affiliation. I do not care who you voted for, but I do need you to understand what is happening in politics right now by elected officials that is impacting this community. This is about human rights. It's not about partisan politics, if you will. And so in the past 2 years, we've seen some pretty major shifts. We've seen, for years, I've been doing this, and I've been saying every year we've had unprecedented attacks on this community. And every year it gets worse and worse and worse. We've seen the number of bills introduced on a statewide level, but also on a federal level, increase almost every year. And those have been attacks on things like making sure people have access to the bathrooms where they're going to be safest and that align with who they are. Making sure people have access to medical care. And so in these past 2 years, as these things have continued to escalate, we've seen major attacks on medical care for young people. Now, please know that medical care for trans young people is not something that is taken on lightly or easily. There are many checks and balances, hoops to jump through for better and worse. And young people and their parents work with multidisciplinary teams of experts to figure out what is the appropriate care for them. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. It really varies individual to individual. But that care has been become really difficult to access. Over half the states in this country have banned gender-affirming care for minors. And then in the past 2 years, we've seen federal attacks that have really shut down the majority of our gender-affirming care providers in major children's hospitals all over the country. Now, there's legal battles going on through all of that, and we actually just saw her had another win just yesterday as far as trying to fight some of the language and the attempts to ban it without evidence-based science behind it. And so it really depends. In New Jersey, it is not illegal. We continue to have access, but what we've seen is that providers have shut down because they're afraid of the implications when it comes to federal consequences. And so I spend a lot of my time right now I'm in group chats with 400 parents across New Jersey, and every time there's another doctor says they're going to stop providing care or another headline comes up, the group chat just explodes, and I'm working with parents all over the state trying to figure out when their kid is losing care, what that's going to mean, and how we can try to get them safe care otherwise. To put it in a little bit of perspective, we're talking about like teens, 16, 17, even 18-year-olds, because the bans that have been created are actually for under 19. So you even reach past legal adulthood. And if a young person has, for instance, been taking gender-affirming hormones, because this is what aligns with who they are, say a transgender girl was on estrogen. If they've been taking estrogen for years, or even for a year or two, and they can no longer access it, they're going to go through menopause. So we have teenagers that are experiencing menopause because they don't have access to the hormones that their bodies require so that they can live their lives. And so the implications are just really messy and tricky, and families are living in crisis. The other things we've seen in the past 2 years, there's certainly been attempts to, and a lot of fear around what happens with marriage equality and that impact when we look at the broader LGBTQ community. And so adults that are in marriages that could be deemed or are afraid to have, could possibly be deemed illegal or invalid are going through the steps to make sure they have all the legal documentation in place so that they're able to, give care, be the person that is there to make decisions for their spouse if their marriage is no longer valid, and that they have guardianship over their children, and all of these things that if you're not living it, you don't realize these are the decisions and conversations people are having. We have also seen attacks on identity documents. Passports, it's been, you can no longer get a passport that aligns with your gender identity. So my daughter has a passport that says female and has for years, thankfully, and it's good for another 4 more years, I think we have. But if you didn't have one or if you need to renew it, then it's reverting to your birth gender. And what that means is my daughter is, when you see her, you do not have any idea that she happens to be transgender. She is a 19-year-old girl with long blonde hair and I don't know, she's Rebecca, but you don't expect that. And so if you look at her and you look at a passport that says male, that puts her at risk in every way because it outs her identity. It also, sometimes people will say, well, this isn't you. You have someone else's, identity documents. And so it's really concerning around that. And then just the emotional and mental pain of that. And so we've seen identity documents, we've seen healthcare, and then there's been this really intentional look at creating, kind of beginning to track who are trans people and where are they in the world, and how do we, there are people making lists, like actually lists of these people, which is really scary because when those kinds of lists have existed throughout history, they're not for good reasons. And so we've seen states doing that. Tennessee right now it hasn't been signed into law, but it's been passed, where they've passed legislation that would require hospitals to report any gender-affirming care for anyone of any age, not just young people, every month, down to details that would very specifically define who that person is. Like, this is not anonymized data, so that they can track that and create data to know where that is. We saw subpoenas for children's hospitals across the country taking patient data who had received gender-affirming care, including birth dates, social security numbers, addresses, and all of the care they've received. Some of those hospitals fought those in court and eventually won. We go to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or at least where my daughter did, and they fought and won, which was great. Other hospitals were too afraid to fight and so handed over data. And so families are knowing that all of this is happening at the same time, and as a result, the level of fear and anxiety is so high that I don't know anyone in the community who hasn't considered leaving the country. Obviously, many of us are still here, but I can tell you, when we look at the data, I think the last survey I saw was like over 70% of at least parents with trans children had seriously considered leaving the country. When I look at our community of people, especially that have been as visible advocates as our family have, my family, and I think there's one other, are the only ones left still in the country. Everyone else has left for safety reasons. And so understanding that these are really scary times and these young people are going through their lives every day, and the adults who care about them, and then trans adults are vulnerable in other ways, and then the rest of the LGBTQ+ community are also vulnerable. And so understanding what that means to go through your day every day, trying to do all the normal things. As a parent, it's trying to make sure my kids do their homework and maybe eat a vegetable if I can get them to, and all of that, while also knowing that all of this is happening. And young people who want to be just concerned about their next science test are worried about their access to healthcare and if they're going to be able to have it or what's it going to mean. And so in all of this, and I'm sure you've seen, regardless of kind of how you relate to the news, what the headlines look like these days. Every day it's constant, and they seem more extreme, sometimes more far-fetched, even if they're actually happening, around all sorts of topics, and it's so impossible to keep up with. And like I mentioned, a lot of these things are being fought in court, and that's true around the LGBTQ+ community and a lot of other things. But it's so hard to, you see a headline that they lost something or they won something, and you don't know what that means. Does that mean that's forever in place, or this has passed, but maybe it passed the House, but not the Senate? Has it been signed into law? And so the news cycle just means we keep seeing stuff constantly without actually knowing what this changes on the ground. Is this in effect? Is this going to be in effect? Is this just talking points? And so the level of anxiety is so high, and we've seen that when we look at the data of LGBTQ youth. Overwhelmingly, their rates of anxiety and depression continue to climb, and more than 90% indicate that the political climate is a key factor in that. And when we've always kind of seen disproportionately high rates of anxiety and depression among these young people, and I think sometimes there's a tendency to be like, well, there must be something wrong with them. Why is this so bad? But we know on the flip side, when they have access to support and affirmation, that those statistics are drastically different. In fact, there was data, it's a couple years old now, that just one supportive adult in the life of an LGBTQ young person reduces the risk of suicide by 40%. That's just one adult. Like every single one of you can be that adult for someone. And what if we can give them entire congregations, entire families, entire schools, and so on? And so this community does not struggle because there's something wrong with them. They struggle because of what they face in society. And so what does that mean to us as people of faith? We are called not to be partisan political. That's not our thing, absolutely not. And church and state are meant to be separate in all of the ways. And we are called to engage in civic life and work for justice of the most vulnerable. And we see that the ELCA actually adopted a new social statement this past summer on faith and civic life. And it's a really cool statement. If you all haven't dug into it at all, there's a great little discussion series that goes with it and resources. But it talks about what is the church's role in all that's going on in the world. And it's not specific to this time. It was worked on for years and then was voted on at our church-wide assembly in August in Phoenix. And it talks about, what does the Bible say about who we're meant to be? Jesus wasn't a political figure as far as a partisan political, but Jesus was inherently, his identity, his existence was political in the same way that we see communities' identities are politicized, whether they want to be political or not. LGBTQ plus people's identities are political whether they want them to be or not. And so what does it mean? We know that it's our job to be good citizens, to participate in the civil processes that, in ways that support doing good in the world, carrying out who we're called to be. God created each and every one of us we're called to create, the kingdom of heaven here on earth, and that looks like being in community with one another. And so I think we get really scared around this political idea about church shouldn't be political. No, we shouldn't be endorsing candidates. It's not about him or her, this party or that party, absolutely not. It's about, what do we care about human beings, and what does that mean? Where is justice? Where is love? Where is mercy? Where do those show up? And then the thing that with our politics right now is it is so divisive. We are so hyper separated. And church is one of the few places where I hope, and I think it's still true in a lot of places, we come together with people who think and believe differently than we do, whose lived experiences out in the world is different than what ours has been. And I think sometimes when we get into this engagement in civic life, or the church shouldn't be political, besides the fear of it being political in that partisan way, the other fear I think is that we're going to have to all endorse some sort of statements that we all agree this to be a part of this community. And that's not what it's about at all. Sometimes my life would be easier if we all agreed the same thing. It's just true. But I don't want that. That's not who God created us to be. That's not the beautiful diversity of God's creation. We are each divine creations. And so as different as we are, being able to see the divine in you and you and you and you, and know that I'm seeing more of who God is, helps me enter into relationships with human beings different from me and alike, who agree with me, who don't agree with me, in a different way. It changes the way we show up in the world. I'll often say all beliefs can be welcome here, but all behaviors are not. And so maybe we believe different things. Maybe I'm in rooms all the time with people who say, no, I don't think children should be able to transition. That's just wrong. Children aren't transgender. And I can say, I understand. And they can be really passionate about it. And I can look at them and say, I can tell you really care about young people. You care about their health and their well-being and about the way they're going to live in the world. I'm not going to agree with them. We may never agree, and that's okay. But I can, instead of saying, well, you're a bad person for believing that, I can see where that's coming from. We have shared values underneath that all. And when we can find those shared values, and when we're here in places of faith, those shared values hopefully are coming from the gospel and who we believe we are created to be and who Christ is, then that allows us to disagree in a different way. Disagree in a way that allows us to remain in relationships. And so one of the things we did when Rebecca transitioned, our congregation had never met a transgender person, or the majority of our congregation had never met a transgender person that they were aware of before Rebecca. They had no idea. And so we didn't expect them all to be 100% ready to march and wave in their pride flag, but we needed to create a safe space for her. So we said, listen, you can have all the questions you want. You don't have to agree with our parenting decisions. You don't have to endorse them, but you have to use our name and pronouns. That's just basic respect. And you can have all the questions you want, and we will try to help you answer them or get someone who can, but you can't ask those questions of Rebecca, and you can't ask them in front of Rebecca. Because debating someone's identity in front of them is not safe, is not healthy, is not what we are called to do. And yet maybe you really do have big questions that you want to ask, and there can be a place for that, but not all places and not all times. And so by doing that, we were able to put this bubble of protection around Rebecca while walking with the people around us who had real questions and misgivings and wonderings, and we're all in their own places on this journey. And so what does it look like in our spaces of faith, in our communities, out in our neighborhoods, everywhere, to say, we don't all have to agree, but this is what it looks like to show up as a person of faith, to treat everyone with dignity and respect and care, because they are a beloved child of God, whether you agree with them or not, while protecting the most vulnerable in our midst. And I think that creates a different kind of space where we don't all have to be filling out this little survey of check marks to say, yeah, I'm going to be this kind of person or this kind of thing, or this is what it means to be a Lutheran here in this place. It's going to look a million different ways, but we have to protect the most vulnerable. It's what we're called to do as people of faith. So then we think about needing to show up with civic engagement, being involved, understanding what's going on in the world. It can be really hard. Again, those headlines, they're constant. I always encourage people, pick one news source that you are going to look at. Don't look at it all day long. Please don't leave the TV news on all day. Don't scroll on your phone all day. Set a timer for the time you're going to check in and find out what's going on in the world. I really encourage people to be engaged with your elected officials. Call them regularly. Tell them the things you care about. They may not be the same things I care about, but as people of faith, we should be advocating for things that protect the most vulnerable and work for justice, feed the hungry, house the unhoused, all of these things. And so you can call your legislators every single day. They have to be happy to hear from you. And so you get to make that call and say, hey, today I want to talk to you about this, or I really care about this. And maybe you don't know the exact bills or bill numbers. That's okay too. You can just tell them, I'm a constituent and this is the issue I really want to make sure that you're paying attention to. And when votes come up, you're voting in a way that supports this. That's good Lutheran civic engagement. That's important. Educating ourselves, being willing to engage in conversations like this, learning from people whose lived experiences are different from ours, and sharing that with others. And then I think beyond that, I mean, there's a whole lot of other things you can do, but the other thing is disrupting language and rhetoric that denies the humanity of people, that denies the human dignity that God has given each of us. When we hear people saying things that we just either know are inaccurate or are just not kind, it's important that we use our voice to disrupt that. It can be really uncomfortable to say, oh, I don't think that's the nicest way to say that. Or I actually heard someone say, I'm not sure that's accurate. I can't get all the studies to, fact check you, but I have some questions about that. So maybe even just voicing a little bit of question, a little bit, you don't have to have a thesis to explain to them that what they're saying is wrong, but saying that doesn't sound right. I've, been in a relationship with this person, or I know this family, and that's not been my experience. that matters, because there are really good people all over this country who are hearing bits and pieces of things that are just not accurate about groups of human beings. You know, there was a time when Rebecca was younger, I went to get lab work done, like blood work. So I had a phlebotomist unit draw on my blood, and I had to pick a shirt with a trans flag on it. And she's like, oh, what's that? I was like, oh, I have a transgender child, and I explained it. And she said, oh, you know, it's really horrible how they're doing those surgeries on those kids. And I was like, oh, and this was a medical professional. And they said, you know what, they're actually not doing surgeries on kids. Overwhelmingly, people have to be 18 years old to have surgery. There are rare exceptions, or there used to be, there aren't really anymore, where 16 and 17-year-olds are having surgeries, but it's never on young children. That's not happening. And she said, oh, really? And I said, no. And she's like, that's such a relief, because I heard on the news, or I heard this person say that. This was a good person working in healthcare who had heard something that if I didn't know otherwise, and you told me they were just doing surgeries on 5-year-olds, I would say, that doesn't sound right. Maybe we should have some questions about that. Most people would be concerned about that. And so more information and being able to say, you know what you're saying just doesn't sound quite true. I think we might want to look into that, can be really powerful, because it changes those echo chambers we get stuck in when we hear things that sound like, that's bad. I absolutely want to advocate against that, but maybe we don't have the whole picture. So that's kind of like some background things. I could go on talking for a long time. I obviously do this a lot. But I'm really curious, what are your questions, or what is this like as you? I mean, are there things that I said that surprised you? Are there questions you have about the LGBTQ community or transgender young people in the world, or your role as a Lutheran in this moment? Yeah.
Question. You said that a lot of your community
Yeah.
have, at least at one point in time, talked about leaving the country,
Yeah.
going to a different country.
Yep.
What country would that be?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It really varies.
Because Europe has gotten a little lax.
Oh, absolutely. So it varies a lot depending on if they have trans young people that are under 18. There are specific countries where access to medical care is better than others. It'll depend on who they are. Like, I have one family who were of Mexican descent. Her husband is a first-generation American, Spanish speakers, so they might end up somewhere different than a family that didn't have that language background. And then also, what are the visa options? What are their work situations? So Canada is a great option in a lot of ways if you can get work situation, because there are no places right now where LGBTQ people from the US are considered refugees. We're not at that point, even though there's been arguments to be made for that. We've had quite international organizations that talk about genocide and are experts on genocide say that we are at the not just very beginning stages of genocide when it comes to trans people, but like the next second and third stages, and explanations about how that's systematically done. And so when you look at that, we wonder about if that refugee status will change. Other countries that have been popular, Costa Rica is actually a pretty great place. Some people have done well in Mexico. Portugal and Spain are good. I know some folks that are headed to the Netherlands. Again, it depends on what your own work, and then if people have ancestry anywhere where they can get citizenship easily, that's a huge thing that people are taking up for sure. But it's not easy, and so you talk about the access and the ability that even if families want to consider leaving the country, it's not an easy thing to do. You have to have the resources and the means and ways to work and all of that. And our family has certainly considered it. I will say about a year ago, a little over a year ago, because of how public my family has been, we are probably one of the 20, maybe 12 most public families when it comes to trans young people in the country. And so one of the national advocacy organizations connected this group of families with a lawyer and said, these are the things you need to be considering. And so our daughter had turned 18, so we made sure we have all powers of attorney for her so that if we need to handle her finances, if she needs to leave the country urgently, we can manage her bank accounts and all of that. We have all that kind of stuff set up. she left for college in the fall. She left for college with a go bag so that if she needs to urgently leave the country at the last minute, she has everything she needs. That includes like a flash drive with all of her medical history and her documents, a stockpile of medication that we had to go to many of our providers and ask for multiple prescriptions and pay out of pocket. My clergy spouse in his pastor collar was like, I feel like a drug dealer as I go to all of these pharmacies and pay cash for her medication, but we didn't know how long she'd be able to access it, and so we have a stockpile. She has all her passport, all of her identity documents, copies, and then we have copies on the thumb drive, and then I have copies where I can access them. She has cash. She has addresses of people in Canada that will keep her safe in the short term. We have folks in Denmark who will keep her safe longer term. And we have people, she's in New Hampshire, local, wonderful Lutheran church members who I know will get her across the Canadian border. Now I say all of this often because it's the most, if you had told me 5 years ago, I'd be in a position where I was sending my kid with a go bag to college in case she needed to flee, I would have thought you were crazy. And people always ask, well, like, what is the scenario where you'd have to use that? Well, on one level, we don't know. We don't know what that scenario is. What we know is that our family is certainly on one of the many lists that exist because of the level of advocacy we've done. We know that there are not legal ways currently to detain trans people, but we also know, we have seen with immigration and other things, that that doesn't always matter. And so depending on and then we're seeing state laws change really rapidly. One of the most devastating laws, well, there's two really devastating ones that were passed state-wise recently. Kansas changed the law so that you can't get a driver's license, or you can't change the gender marker on your driver's license or your birth certificate. So that's really bad all by itself. But what it did was overnight, literally overnight, if you had ever changed the gender marker on your birth certificate or your driver's license, those documents were invalid. So trans people woke up and had driver's license and birth certificates that were no longer valid. They had to drive to the DMV to be able to surrender them and get new ones, and they didn't have driver's licenses that were valid. And so the concern about that, when you're a vulnerable population, what does that mean? You're basically now breaking the law in order to do what's being required of you, and there's just a lot of trauma and fear in that. The other state law that we saw pass, and the problem is when we see these like one-off state laws that feel really extreme, what we've seen over the past 5 to 8 years is that they are copy-pasted across the country, and we see them spread really quickly. The other one is that in Idaho, they passed a bathroom ban that says you can't use the bathroom that aligns with your gender identity. It has to be based on your sex assigned at birth, which again, you see my objectively beautiful 19-year-old daughter walk into a men's room, she's not going to be safe. But what's the most terrifying about the Idaho one is it says that it is your third infraction is a felony, and punishable by imprisonment for like up to 5 years. And if you've had an infraction in another state with a law before that, that counts as your priors already when you walk into Idaho. And so what does that mean? Like, we are creating pathways to imprison people in really scary ways. And so when we talk about why would you need to flee, we don't know. We were told by a lawyer that we should have backup plans to say if we need to leave our home for a period of time, like a defined, we need to have a place to go that we have keys to, that people will not be surprised if we're there when they come home. We need to have a place that if we have to leave the state, and a place that if we have to leave the country. And the hope is that it would be temporary and as the courts worked things out, but that trust in the courts wavers every day, and so that's the kind of concerns. But these are the kind of heavy conversations that families in our communities are having and trying to figure out, what does this look like? How do we keep our families safe? What protections do we put in place? All while trying to manage everything else that we all deal with on a daily basis, which is a lot. Like, no matter what age you are, it's your family, it's your loved ones, it's, prices on groceries, it's, all of the things. And so, yeah, that's kind of the world. That was a very long answer to your question. Other questions or things you're wondering about, or comments?
Yeah, I had a professor at one time tell us that this was many moons ago.
Yeah.
Control is best achieved your experience,
Yeah.
what motivates these lawmakers?
Mm-hmm.
It
Yeah.
has to be motivation.
Yeah.
What motivates these lawmakers
Yeah.
to seek the path that they are seeking?
Fear is a very effective motivator for people, and when you can make people afraid, you can stay in power. Power is what's behind it. I mean, managing, and so we've been able to distract from some really big problems that we have in our country and in the world by creating this scapegoat community to say they are the problems. Guess what? One high school volleyball player who happens to be transgender, whether they are winning or losing or whatever the case may be, is not actually impacting your life. It is not the reason we're at war. It is not any of the things you could say, whatever things that are important to you, that's not causing it. And I don't care, like whatever those things, we all have the things that we care most about. It's not the reason that we need to better care for our veterans. It's not the reason that we're not doing whatever the case may be. And so we've been able to fearmonger people into believing that this community is the problem. And because when we talk about, like, privilege is a really tricky word for people. Privilege and vulnerabilities and things like that, because I think we all have places where our lives are really hard. Like, and we can look at it and be like, what privilege are you talking about? I can barely pay my bills. I'm, struggling to do this and do all of that. And so whenever we can see a community that we can say, well, they're the reason that my life is hard, and if we could just fix that, then my life would be better. There's something really simple and human that makes you want to believe that makes you want to say, oh, like, so many people are struggling on the day-to-day for a variety of reasons, regardless of background, regardless of demographic, and just want life to be easier. And so if we can point to that these people are the problem. And then I think the other thing is that, like, it is that misunderstanding that, like, if I can say we're doing surgeries on 5-year-olds, well, everybody's going to think that's a terrible thing. And so, like, that, but the goal, the reason we do that is because then it's a bit of a distract, and it's also a motivate. We can get people to show up, to vote, to call our legislators, to say this is a problem if we've given them a reason to, and that helps protect money and power. I mean, overwhelmingly, if you look at the people that are benefiting from the way that we are harming any individual community, it is billionaires. Like that's and huge corporations. No average American is winning at this moment in time. We're just not. Yeah. Yeah.
What do they expect to gain? I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
just beyond my comprehension.
Because I think it goes into an entire worldview. Like, so when it's a very small jump, so we can talk about money and power, but then we can also talk about white Christian nationalism and what do they believe the world should look like? And that social statement I mentioned, Faith and Civic Life, was really important because it was the first document coming out of the ELCA that, rooted in Luther's teachings and our beliefs and the gospel, called out white Christian nationalism as something that Lutherans needed to advocate against, that this was a problem. Because this is saying this is what is good and this is not. And that insider-outsider space and creating a world where that looks exactly like you is a very specific thing. People are afraid of people that are different from them. And that whole thing, like, again, fear motivates. And so it's all a channel to that in the interest of an ideology that believes we are better than other human beings. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. When Rebecca, we kind of stumbled into our life as public advocates when it was in 2017, and the federal administration had rescinded the guidance for transgender students in schools. Rebecca was 10 years old. She didn't know a lot about what was going on. She knew that it was making trans kids scared, and she she thought everybody should have safe, supportive schools. And so I offered to speak at a rally, and they said, yeah, you and Rebecca can speak. And I was like, what? She's 10. But I asked her, and she said, yes, I want to talk. And so at that rally, she had a sign, and she's wearing her little pink puffy coat, and she had dyed pink hair because pink was her favorite color and was braided into pigtails. and she was holding a sign that said, "I'm the scary transgender person the media warned you about." And it went wildly viral because we had this idea. There was much less public representation of what it meant to be trans then. We had this idea of what transgender looked like. And it wasn't this cute little girl in front of you who was just living her life and wanting to be herself, and who was being who God created her to be. And that's at its most simple. You know, people always love to say God doesn't make mistakes as a thing against this community. And I think it's kind of funny because I wholeheartedly agree. God does not make mistakes. There is nothing about my child or any other trans person that I've met, they are the most incredible human beings, that is a mistake. Each of us was created in the image of God to be exactly who we know ourselves to be. And that's a beautiful gift. To think that God could only create people who think and look and act in a certain way that fit into these tiny boxes of what this specific place and time has decided is right for a man or a woman is so short-sighted. Our God is so much bigger than that. God's creation is so much bigger than that. People go to, Genesis. Well, God created male and female. You're right. And when we look at the Hebrew, that "and" wasn't a this box or that box, but more of a spectrum. Everything from this to that. Even when we talk about alpha and omega, it just doesn't mean this and that. It means God is everything. Male and female, all sorts of things. Because then we look through the rest of Genesis. God created day and night, but God created sunrises and sunsets, some of the most beautiful times of the day. And that is not unique, this is not my idea. Wonderful trans theologians have said this, and there's been all sorts of kind of ways to describe and talk about the rich diversity of the natural and human world God created. Yeah. Yeah.
We do have a national resource representing.
Yes. Yes.
What is the synodical?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know what its name is right now. We had an LGBTQIA task group. We might still, but it is underneath, I believe we have a service and justice team for the synod. And so underneath that, we have our anti-racism team. We have the LGBTQIA. And so they are doing work on behalf of our synod, and they are a resource you can reach out to for information. There is a workshop day coming up. I don't remember the date, but it's in our Jersey Jottings emails. It's called Faith, Hope, and Love. It's kind of a spin-off of an event that we used to have called Faith, Hope, and Love. I'm not sure why they called it the same thing, but that's besides the point. But it's actually a day of education, storytelling, and advocacy around LGBTQIA justice, immigration, and racial justice and advocacy. And so we have synodical resources where they don't put out the kind of tools that Reconciling Works does but we are a Reconciling in Christ synod, as well as we have congregations like y'all that are as well. And so they are kind of our synodical version of that. Yeah. Yep. Other questions, thoughts? You can tell me something I said that made you really mad too. That doesn't upset me. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yep, absolutely. But we had the subpoenas. Yeah. So the thing that happened, I'm not sure the ins and outs of the Tennessee law and how they're getting around that one, but when it was the subpoenas for all the children's hospitals, we were told that HIPAA didn't protect us in any way, shape, or form. Because it was those subpoenas were sent, the angle, so what we're finding is that they're taking every angle in every way. So this is we have stuff coming down from HHS. We have stuff coming from, executive orders from the White House. We have stuff coming through, the subpoenas came from consumer rights, and it was basically they were accusing hospitals of committing fraud by misbilling, like billing for using other diagnosis codes than gender dysphoria in order to give this care. And so because it was a fraud investigation, none of that applied. Now the level of information they were asking was absolutely unusual for that, because even when there are fraud cases, they are not usually asking for social security numbers and birth dates and all of this identifying data, but they were, because it's about more than that. Yeah, and so that's why some of the hospitals fought, thankfully, but some didn't. And it's been really hard for people to find out, even of the hospitals that we know publicly didn't invite, because the hospitals tried to keep as much under seal as possible as they were moving through the court system. And so you have all these families who are desperate, also trying to like teach ourselves the legal system to understand what every ruling means and what all is going on. But there's also stuff that they're trying to keep quiet as it moves in order to not then create more chaos, or there's different reasons. And so it's been really hard for families of those hospitals that we know, to our knowledge, weren't in lawsuits, to discover what information and how much they gave up. Did they make a deal and say you can have this but not this? Did they hand it all over? Families don't know how much of their personal data was handed over to the government. Oh, there you go. I'm not involved in it, but I hear it should be lovely. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah?
How was your family's reaction to the Supreme Court decision about conversion therapy?
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that one. There's so much, like, it's coming, like you're drinking from a fire hose constantly. So, for context, the Supreme Court basically upheld the concern of a Colorado therapist was saying that the Colorado conversion therapy ban, so it was a law in Colorado that said you can't do conversion therapy, which is therapy designed to make someone not gay or not trans. This is therapy that has been widely discredited and has been shown to be deeply harmful. In fact, we know when we look at like the suicidality and the data I said around depression and anxiety, young people, the data I have is for, I think it's like 12 to 24-year-olds that experience attempts to change their gender identity or sexuality are more than twice as likely to attempt suicide than those who don't experience that therapy. So not only does it not work, but it's deeply harmful. So there was a ban, we have a ban like that in New Jersey. Colorado had a ban, and there was a therapist who said not being able to, that basically it was restricting her speech in therapy, her free speech, to be able to not tell someone that maybe you're not gay, maybe this would fix you to just not be that way. And so the Supreme Court upheld her right to say that, like, so struck down Colorado's law and said it was unconstitutional. Now the way it basically said, the laws can still exist, so like the laws are still standing in other states, but it makes them really vulnerable, and they're not going to protect people in the same way. And so it's a really weird place to be in because we don't know the implications. I was just talking to the executive director for Washington State's LGBTQ Commission, and she's trying to connect to other states that have these laws to say, what is our plan here? Because nobody knows what to do, because the laws are still in the books, and the laws aren't unconstitutional as they are, but they can't be enforced in the same way. And so the practical applications are confusing and tricky, which makes all of this even harder. But then to understand the impact, I think the hardest part of that ruling was seeing and hearing from the people I know or am in relationship with or connected to in advocacy who have experienced that type of quote-unquote therapy, who were told that who they were is wrong. It's often done from a religious standpoint. So being told that who you are, who God created you to be, is wrong in God's eyes is devastating. It's why people leave the church and never want to come back. It causes deep harm and is something you don't ever, like, that trauma is something many, many, many people live with. And those are the people that survived it. We've lost many, many humans to that. And so it breaks my heart. I think seeing those people re-traumatized is devastating, and then knowing that we're just kind of opening doors for that to happen again. And so I think I think I mean, you can figure the courts have to do their thing and states have to figure it out, but as individuals, again, as people of faith, just makes me want to say louder, more boldly, more loudly, more joyfully, that LGBTQ plus people are created in the image of God to be who they are. You're not a mistake. You're not a problem. You don't need to be fixed. We're glad you're you. Because then you think about the young people, these young people who spend a lot of their times on social media, on Instagram, on TikTok, and they're scrolling, and you're just being exposed, even if it's just the headlines and the news. It is so maybe you're not listening to anyone that is saying harmful messages, but even the people that are talking about the news and what's happening, it's just in their face constantly. And so even if you have a supportive family, even if you have a supportive congregation, knowing that the entire country is talking about your identity and debating whether you should get to exist as who you are, that messes you up. To put it quite frankly, it just does.
You can't go through life thinking everything, I need to be fixed.
Exactly, yeah. Well, and especially you think about adolescents who are already struggling to find their identity and are so vulnerable with messages from outside and the pressure to fit in and to be who they are, and then to have this message that they know this about themselves, but that they're telling, especially. So when we talk about faith and depression, anxiety, and suicidality, overwhelmingly for young people, a strong faith is a protective factor against suicide. Makes sense. If you have this connection to faith and a God who created you and you know you are loved, that can be really strong and protect your mental health. The only group that's not true for, and this is data that's probably late 2019, 18, 19, I want to say. So we don't have recent data on it. But the only group it's not true for are LGBTQ plus people of faith. These are people who faith is really important to them. They believe in God. Their church families are important to them. And they happen to be LGBTQ as well. For them, it actually increased their risk of suicide to have a strong church connection. Because, think about it, if you care deeply about your faith, and you're being told that this God that you're orienting your whole life to thinks that there's something inherently wrong with you, that's devastating. And so that's why it's so important that in faith spaces, we are making clear that you are not broken, that you are who God created you to be. Yeah. It's really hard. Those messages, I think any type of emotional abuse, when we think about young people who are being told that who they are is bad, and then we kind of institutionalize it from a faith perspective, that's really, it just carries a lot of weight. Thoughts, questions? Thanks for listening to me ramble. I'm happy to talk more, but I don't have to. I'm glad for your time. I'm glad, I understand that hearing these things, regardless sometimes whether it's your personal experience or maybe you're coming at it from a different viewpoint, can be hard. It's uncomfortable to hear what's going on in the world and to try to make sense of it. And again, I'm not suggesting that every single one of you agrees with everything I said. That's okay. I am sharing our lived experience and what this means and what this community of people, from my understanding and my experience being connected to families like mine all over the country, are experiencing. And so then what does that mean for us as people of faith? We don't all have to agree, but we can connect to each other as siblings in Christ, as part of the body of Christ, that have far more in common than we do differences. We have so much more in common. God created each of you and God created me. And if we can continue to go back to that and treat other human beings with that as the most important thing, then we're kind of on the right path, even if we don't get everything else right along the way. So I'm grateful for you, grateful for your open minds and hearts, and I'm happy to answer other questions if you have individual things you want to come talk to me. You can hang out for a little bit. Yeah, my pleasure. Well, I was glad for you all. Oh, I can